from a very young age, I loved doing art, I suppose. I loved doing it at school. My mum was a potter in her spare time, and I sort of mucked about in her sort of pottery studio. And but it was really, I just kind of loved doing drawings. I used to do really silly drawings of things like eggs running around on these little legs and things like that, and then made silly little sort of sculptures in clay. Kind of what I do now. I sort of feel like my life has been a kind of succession of regressions or something. It's kind of sometimes better when the work has that kind of simplicity somehow. The new videos I've made are really new, and I think sometimes when you make new work, you just kind of make it. And so I've just sort of been thinking about it a bit this afternoon prior to talking to you. I don't know, I've done, like, in performance, the idea of destruction has been quite kind of relevant. There's an early video that I mentioned to you, I think, which is called Excavation, which is now about 15 years old, where I just have a lump of concrete on my head. So kind of like that. And I'm just chipping away. For that video, it was sort of a sense of destruction is a kind of a creative act through performance in a way. So what I'm doing is, by creating a narrative of destroying something, so I've got this bit of concrete on my head. By destroying it, I'm creating a sort of a narrative, and it's actually sort of, when we sort of think of destruction, we think of it perhaps in the negative. It's a sort of bad thing, or I don't know, it has sort of, obviously in terms of sort of acts of iconoclasm and in many sort of situations, it has a really sort of bad sort of meaning. With this video, it was about a kind of sense of revealing a kind of like a sense of what's behind a mask, perhaps, what's sort of internalized, perhaps. So linking a material process to a psychological one. So by destroying, by physically breaking a material, in a way, maybe it alludes to an idea of what's sort of psychologically happening. What happens when you psychologically break? I don't want to be sort of too literal with that, because the work has hopefully several meanings. I don't try to sort of dictate what an understanding of the work might be, but that for me is one of the sort of interesting things. There's a nice quote by Freud about the idea of burial, in a sort of archaeological sense, burial being repression and excavation being analysis. So in a way, what I'm doing, the destructive aspect of that video where I'm chipping away at concrete, is a sort of a process of sort of self-analysis. But that's one very particular sort of niche or rarefied understanding of the piece of work. I mean, the other thing is it's just a lot of fun to break things, to destroy things as well. And it's something that's a bit of a taboo. So I suppose the video allows me to kind of do something that's a bit naughty, and that's kind of fun in a way. I get the impression that with sort of feedback I've had with that video, people sort of quite enjoy that as well. It's sort of loud, and it kind of makes a crashing sound. Breaking things, it has that quality. I think claustrophobia is a really good way of describing it. It is sort of how I feel. What the work does is it deliberately, in terms of me being a performer, what it does is it really reduces sort of senses. So I can't see, I can't breathe so well, I can't really hear. So for example, when I have the concrete on my head, I can't hear it so much. So there is claustrophobia, but there's almost something about being kind of cocooned as well. So there is, when I think of the work, particularly the work where I peel, I actually have it here. I've got the wire. So when I peel back a layer of clay, I don't know, it's kind of about, kind of revealing a sense of sort of interiority, I suppose. I also think about the idea of abjection. What you see when you're watching the video is something much more sort of severe and kind of crazy and over the top than what's actually happening behind the scenes is a little bit more, I hate to use the word controlled, but I've worked at the kind of like the details of it. It really varies. Some of them are really quick. So the ones where I've got those ones where I've got paint are really quick, and it's so funny with art. I know my experience of art is that series. I don't always. I'm very sort of critical about my work, but those were just kind of golden in the sense of they were really quick to do. They were really straightforward, and the effect was quite sort of strong. Whereas, say, the ones with concrete, they take ages. It takes a really long time to make a sort of armature in that way. The concrete needs about 2 weeks to set properly before, and then otherwise it will just sort of crumble. So really, yeah, basically it totally varies. Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, this maybe leads me on to, there's another work I did which is really sort of not related to these videos, which are quite sort of slapstick and which are quite sort of humorous. A work I did about sort of 9 or 10 years ago I was really lucky. I was invited to do a residency at an art and craft centre in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I was doing sort of workshops for young Afghani artists and students. And as part of that, they arranged for me to go to Bamiyan Valley, which was where the Taliban had destroyed the Buddha monuments back in 2001 in about March. So that was about 6 months before 9/11. And it was a kind of almost like a sort of a prelude to this awful act of destruction and carnage. This one was much more of an iconoclastic act. So they dynamited this beautiful Buddhist monument, and it was a little bit of a kind of way of drawing attention to their cause, I suppose. I mean, there are some really awful bits of public art. So maybe if I had a budget. So my studio is in the East End of London on a place called Fish Islands, which is right by the Olympic Park, where the Olympics was hosted in 2012 here. And as part of that, the British artist Anish Kapoor made I don't know if you know it, but he made a kind of like a spiral ziggurat sculpture out of steel, like a spiral, sort of DNA spiral by the Olympic Stadium. It sort of seemed to be a sort of an act of kind of hubris, a very sort of extrovert act of kind of sort of showing off. The idea was maybe sort of thought about and then produced without too much sort of thought. If I had some budget, I'd quite like to think about some way of dismantling that or destroying that in an entertaining way. I really hate it. I mean, some of the advice I had, say, when I was a student, which I sort of ignored, was to sort of go with my more kind of experimental urges. I in a way, like a lot of art students, I mean, when I was younger, had a sort of tendency to sort of make art that I thought would be perhaps accepted, that I thought was the right type of art to make. And I made some, I mean, I'm not saying my work is amazingly interesting now, but I made some really boring, sort of stilted bits of art. Just do what you want to do. In a way, don't worry about sort of the results so much. Perhaps there's something about the idea of destruction which is sort of links to that in a way, in terms of the way I followed up with my work. So not necessarily being really too worried about a kind of final outcome. I suppose when you make a piece of work, to kind of think about it at the stages in which it's being made, kind of evaluate it say your work is half made, to evaluate it and think, well, do I actually want to go ahead with the way I was thinking of, the way I'd imagine the artwork to be made, or do I want to do something that takes the work on a total sort of detour? And I think when I was younger, I felt a lot of pressure to sort of stay sort of quite, I thought it was more professional maybe to stay quite faithful to the original ideas I had. And I probably could have done with someone just saying, hey, look, don't worry, there's loads of time to make other pieces of work, so perhaps take a few more risks with what you're doing. One of my favourite artists, although his work is nothing like my work, but I love his work and admire him greatly. And that's Gustav Metzger, who pioneered a kind of a sort of movement called Destruction in Art. And so he organised an event called Destruction in Art Symposium. And he was an artist. Very sadly, he died about 2 years ago, but created works such as wearing a mask and then throwing acid at a canvas. And his work was really from about the 1950s until about 2018, was really about the idea of anti-capitalism, and the idea of not having an object, the idea of the remains being some sort of evidence, but not a commercial sort of art object. So Gustav is wonderful, but I'm perhaps not as sort of politically motivated, but I agree with a lot of his politics, but in terms of my art, I'm more sort of ambiguous. And then in terms of sort of more kind of formal aspects of my work, I absolutely love the Austrian artist Franz West, who makes sort of amazingly kind of wobbly, sort of strangely shaped, suggestive sort of bodily sexual sculptures, and also something called an adaptive, which is a kind of like these blobby shapes that you might wear on your shoulder, on your head, or lean against, or something like that. And there was an exhibition of his work at the Tate Modern about 2 years ago, a year ago, where you could actually try these objects as well. That show was curated by Sarah Lucas, who's another artist I love. In terms of sort of figuration, I'm a big fan of Huma Barber, who's got a show on the Baltic Gateshead, who makes sort of figures looking as if they're sort of disintegrating. But also they look a little bit kind of like tribal sculptures as well, but there's a sort of wonderful ambiguity in terms of their execution. I'd love to see the show, but with social distancing and travel, I'm not sure I can get to Newcastle right now to see the show. But I'll be looking at pictures of Huma Barber's work. My videos get very memed. It's part of the reason why I quite like not to be too prescriptive about the meaning of them. So I'll sort of suddenly see, someone has ripped off my video, and an accompanying text about it. So one of the more recent ones is the concrete head, and someone's chipping away at the concrete head, and someone has memed it and said trying to get through to a Trump supporter or something like that, which is great. And I reposted that, and I had a lot of angry Trump supporters piling onto my timeline. But then more prosaic ones, a little bit like the concrete head one, and they're trying to take off my makeup after a night out or something like that. But I'm sort of fascinated by them as a kind of new sort of visual manifestation and a way of kind of communicating through sort of vision and sort of image and text. I've got a show that's opening in Holland at the Prinseshof Ceramic Museum in Leeuwarden. I'm going to have some videos in that. Also a kind of a group show, and it's going to have some other really interesting artists like Natalie Djerberg. And I suppose if anyone's really interested in the idea of clay and ceramics and performance, so sort of fusing those two things, that might be a good place to look. So I imagine they'll probably putting a bit of stuff online. Instagram is just being really helpful for me during lockdown in terms of shows of mine have been postponed and cancelled. So I've been putting a lot of videos up there, and I've got a Vimeo account as well. I've got a really out-of-date website. So maybe Instagram is perhaps the best, and then the show in Holland. I am William Cobbing, and thank you for watching Artsplained.